how do we work with, say, not just our supply chain, so you can do that contractually with the supply chain, but it's actually working with airlines as well, trying to work with them on a common basis to, and if you don't have a common goal, so on Terminal 5 we had a really common goal of where we were going and what we wanted, and that common vision might be Heathrow Airports Limited's vision, but it's starting to become the vision of our partners and the people working with us. Annually we have what we call an awards ceremony around behaviours, and that's not just us internally within Heathrow, that we invite entries from the whole of our supply chain and other organisations working at Heathrow. So that's a way of encouraging that bonding and the same way of working together, and that people start to adopt those behaviours. But we're in the infancy of where that's going. Team Heathrow is where we want to be and where we got to get to. We got that feeling when we were building and hosting the Olympics. It was when you had a common vision and one thing for everyone to gather around, that it's amazing how people work so easily together. You don't have to tell them how to work with each other, they just do.
I think it's because there's a broader piece than just the collaboration on building your project. I think there's some, repairing to do as well with, some of the stakeholders who've obviously had a very, very strong opinion of trying to stop it and block it, and probably still will actually through the DCO process. So that piece for me is really interesting as well. Because your collaboration needs to be,
it's
most of the country.
It is community wide and country wide. And that's certainly why over the last 2 or 3 years we haven't just focused around Heathrow, we focused around the whole of the UK. It's a project for the UK, not just Heathrow.
Quite agree. I think bring the tent experience back, absolutely. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, I would say, I mean, so you mentioned leadership, and I think it's important to recognise that, one of the problems we have today is that tomorrow's leaders are picked by today in their own image. And if you want to create an environment which people are going to buy into, the leadership's got to be there, and it's got to set the drumbeat. My experience is when you give people a challenge, they actually want to get it done. Quite frequently it's their leadership and the long screwdrivers from outside that stop them or constrain them from doing what they want to do. You mentioned the Olympics, you have to remember, 80,000 volunteers who stood all over London moving people around because they wanted to be involved. The leadership was there. And I think as Heathrow, as a client, creating that environment, you'll suck people in. And the interesting thing is that peer pressure is probably one of the greatest things that you can achieve for getting behaviours right, because if people are enjoying it, they don't tolerate the people who don't play the game.
It's very true. Any other points on that issue?
I'll just say, just interesting, your comments about T5. We've still got a few people not normally worked on T5, and they all look back on that with great fondness, that project, and it's not the case of some of the projects they're involved in now. So.
I always use it as a great example, because you've got to remember, at the same time they built T5, somebody built Wembley Stadium. And that was probably one of the biggest contractual cock-ups ever.
Yeah, sadly we're in that one as well.
Sorry about that.
Some sort of honesty box. Next question. Yeah.
As one for Jennifer on your monitoring of ageing infrastructure, how can we get more monitoring in such a huge amount of infrastructure? There's endless amounts of infrastructure which we haven't touched yet in terms of monitoring and sensors. Yeah. How do we do that in terms of funding, in terms of practicality, really?
I mean, you're absolutely right to point out that there is so much, and as I say, we don't only do bridges, but bridges are a nice example. We've been talking about them at work a lot recently, and someone was asking, how many bridges are there in the UK and how many of them might need monitoring at any one time? Well, there are tens of thousands of bridges out there in all kinds of ownership, and even pretty big, reasonably well-financed organisations like Network Rail struggle to invest in the kind of monitoring. So when you're a local authority and you've got a square root of nothing much to spend on each of your bridges, it is really hard. I think there's a certain amount of learning still to do. So that bridge that I showed, I could talk for an hour on just that bridge, but there was quite an intensive monitoring campaign went in at the beginning to understand how it was behaving. Now you can't afford to do that on every bridge, but the more we do it on, the more we learn what the typical behaviours start to look like. And also, once you've understood how a bridge is behaving, you can decide which of the 3 measurements you need to continue to take in order to continue to understand the condition and the degradation of that bridge through time. Because it's about sort of continuing to try and get something out of that infrastructure, or try and get more out of it than you can with poor information. So I think there is certainly something about having a sort of common learning platform and collaborating with each other. There's not a lot of good information sharing, even within an organisation, let alone between organisations. And things like that are definitely areas where learning between organisations and sharing experience, because lots of people have bits of old Victorian infrastructure. They're not all driving trains across them, but there will be some commonalities in the challenges.
I was going to say, there's a risk profile you build up of an asset of a certain age with a certain objective or whatever, which you don't need to then monitor everything, but you can identify the ones that are most at risk or important.
And then the other thing we need to look at is how can we use different kinds of data. So I mentioned briefly satellite data. We're currently looking at the scientific end of what can you really measure with satellite data with respect to what you might want to know about pieces of infrastructure. But if you can do what people think you might be able to do, then that's a great resource, and it's a historic resource, so you can go back in time. So, this is looking a bit flaky. What was it looking like last year, 5 years ago, and 10 years ago? Is that flakiness kind of inherent and long-term, or is it actually getting worse? There's an issue with that at the moment, that satellite data is incredibly expensive to get hold of. And so the first movers got to somehow address that cost issue. So again, there might be again, it comes down to collaboration. If we do show that you can do the right things with satellite data, would it be cost effective for Highways England and Network Rail and some of the local authorities, for example, to team up to start to gather and pull that information? Whereas with one organisation, it just wouldn't be cost effective to do it. So I think there's a chunk of learning we need to do, and we need to do it fast, and we can do it faster by working together better.
So as a technology numpty, it always surprises me that, if you take London, it's got one of the highest concentration of CCTV cameras anywhere in the world, and we're only using it for CCTV. And yet there's a communications network that's all set up that could carry all sorts of other data if you plug something else onto each camera. But that requires a couple of organisations to talk to each other about how to do it.
And there's some really interesting things around, for example, smart cities. So I went to a very interesting meeting a few months ago, and I ended up at a round table with various people from different cities who had the smart cities portfolio. One of them was a buses person, one of them was a lighting person. There's no consistency between cities as to who gets it, because it happens to be whoever's got the technological issue that a smart cities type solution either provides an opportunity to or a challenge. So in the City of London, they see the opportunity to put Wi-Fi on all of their lampposts. So suddenly smart cities becomes the problem of the lighting department. And then they're going to talk to the roads guys saying, would you be interested in using this to do X, Y and Z? And then there's a negotiation internally about who pays for what, and
and then whose budget it comes out of.
Precisely. So this sort of collaborative approach that you talked about having a common purpose and not fighting each other over the silly things, like where does that bit of budget line up to, makes a real difference.
It does.
We still don't see enough clients, owners of the asset ultimately, taking enough ownership of the data during the design and construction process to actually avoid the future problems that they're building up.
And even, might I say, during its lifetime. So I've had conversations with major asset owners, it's not all of them, but some of them, and you say, so what information do you require from your asset management contractor to become handed over to you at the end of the contract, etc.? And they go, oh, well, that's asset management, we'll let the asset management contractors decide that. And I'm thinking that's kind of like asking the poacher to be the gamekeeper at the same time. Not to say that asset management contractors don't do a good job, they do, but where's their commercial incentive to hand over everything they know about that asset at the end of their 5-year contract?
Or even collect it.
Yeah, well, I mean, they'll collect it to serve the purposes that they have for 5 years, but if they don't have a long-term skin in the game, they're not going to collect data today for someone else to be using in 20 years' time unless the client asks them to and pays them to do it.
Yeah, that's the thing. You put it in the contract
Yeah.
and get it to you in a certain format, and that's the only way you'll get it otherwise.
So you can't just divest yourself of all of the technical responsibility for your asset when that happens too often.
Next question. Yeah.
I'm just going to follow up to that in terms of, I was just wondering, I think you might have just answered it, how much clients are embedding the current technologies we have into new infrastructure projects, and if you're, you know, how is that going? Because that seems like that should be something that we should be.
It's up to me.
They look at each other.
You go first, 'cause you're a client, so you'll speak with greater knowledge than me. I'll give an impression, but you can give it back.
But as I was trying to explain now, I mean, we have a lot of disparate sort of systems that probably just don't talk to each other, and it's how do you get all those systems now to talk to each other and work with each other. And over the years, especially a city like Heathrow, as it were, you'll have one system that might control the airfield ground lighting, as an example. Something else controls planes and radar, but we actually want all these things to start to work and talk together, but also in a way that has an open protocol to it, but still has security built in. Because a lot of older systems that we've got within our infrastructure have protocols in that we can't get to, and you might find that small organisation that you've contracted with in good faith over the years has probably only got 2 people in their organisation that know the software codes, and every time you want an alteration, 1 or 2 of those guys have got to come and do it. So you have to somehow move away from that, and that's where you come to this real common place, but in a way that is joined up and is secure, and people can access what they need to access.
I think that is really interesting. I saw there's like a history of IT and how things have obviously got smaller and cleverer and remoter and whatever, but floppy disks are still being used, and actually in airports there's quite a lot of floppy disks still being used because of all the air traffic control side of things, and obviously plane technology as well. So it's really interesting how that we are still needing to use this older technology, and the knowledge of it is going to become a limiting factor at some point.
And there is a tension between the persistence of infrastructure and the rate at which IT and technology changes.
Yeah.
And we've got to be cleverer about how we manage that. Now, kind of, in a way, punting everything up into the cloud is a real opportunity, because then you have an infrastructure system that someone is responsible for, and they will worry about the underlying technology, and all we will have to worry about is, can I get my sticky fingers on the data still? In the same way that we don't tend to get people to treat water individually at their own houses, because actually a water treatment plant can, we can involve the technology in that and do it in a much more controlled way, although we might reverse that at some point. But the sort of the custody of information is a real challenge, and also the sharing of information. I mean, again, not to pick on Network Rail, but I happen to have had a conversation with them. They've got a lot of different systems as well. London Underground has the same thing.
Yeah.
And the guys who worry about tracks or signals in any of the organisations don't have visibility of each other's data. They don't have visibility of any of the geotechnical structures data, and actually they all feed into each other. So if you're monitoring tracks and they're starting to do something a bit weird, you might want to tell the embankments guy, because perhaps his embankment's moving. But there's no easy way to communicate at the moment. And Network Rail are trying to kind of mash all these data systems together. But I think that's probably the first step, is actually to enable us to share the data.
It's really interesting. I mean, one of the other points that was raised earlier was around, I think it was you, David, around HS2 and skills, was it? Yeah. And I remember someone involved with the organisation maybe 2 or 3 years ago said, well, I think it was when they announced the Tunnelling Academy, actually, and they said that some of the people who will work on HS2 haven't been born yet, which is quite interesting, because there were, 3 or 4 years ago, and there was a long way to go to start, let alone complete all these sections that needed to be completed. And that made me, really think and step back, and that's the sort of quantum that we're dealing with. And your T6 is somewhere in between there, isn't it, really? Okay, it's above ground, it's not a tunnel as such, not quite so specialist, but nevertheless, those skills and abilities as well. And I suppose the environment that these new people will come into as well, and how they respond to that environment. All of those are things that we can control to a certain extent, and we can certainly be aware of. And it's just a really interesting
It's-
aspect of these big assets.
It's certainly one of the issues that I've been looking at. I mean, I'll be a bit provocative when it comes into the world of collaboration. My view is that today the grey hairs either get it or they don't. And if they don't get it, they never will. But the next generation of managers that comes out of business schools and universities has got to understand how to play this game. Now, interestingly enough, if you talk to a lot of people, particularly in the IT world, they'll tell you the biggest problem companies have got right now is the young generation coming into the company and telling them not to communicate because they're using social media in the wrong way for their organisations. But if we set up organisations to work in these collaborative models, you've also got to bring on the next generation of managers who are capable of working like that and understand the nuances of, you listen to the gurus who tell you collaboration's wonderful, we're going to share every bit of information, but we don't share every bit of information because it's commercially sensitive, it's politically unacceptable. So you have to define the parameters, and you have to understand you've got to define those parameters to make the kind of system that you work something that people will plug into.
Right, we're going to break for lunch. Any last points from panel that you'd like to make? Well, you're hungrier than that. You've been working, so you need feeding. Right?
Yes.
Right, thank you very much. Right, enjoy your food.